So yesterday we saw what happens to this blastocyst. By the end of the second week, it will be fully embedded within the endometrium. So we saw that in the second week, implantation is completed, whereby our blastocyst fully embeds into the endometrium. Then we also saw that the outer cell mass divides into the cytotrophoblast and syncytiotrophoblast. Then we also saw that the inner cell mass divides into the epiblast and hypoblast. We saw another cavity or a new cavity developing within the epiblast known as the amniotic cavity, which is surrounded by amnioblasts coming from the epiblast germ layer. We also saw that the blastocyst cavity that we had in the first week of intrauterine life becomes lined by these cells of endodermal hypoblast. These cells of endodermal hypoblast migrate and they line the blastocyst cavity, and hence it becomes the primitive yolk sac. We also saw that another layer of cells develops between the cytotrophoblast and the yolk sac, and these cells are known as the extraembryonic mesoderm. Further, we saw that cavities develop in the extraembryonic mesoderm, except at the connecting stalk, where the umbilical cord is going to connect the embryo to the placenta. And then we saw that these cavities coalesce or join to form what we call the chorionic cavity or extraembryonic cavity or extraembryonic serum, except at the connecting stalk. We also saw that cavities develop in the syncytiotrophoblast known as trophoblastic lacunae, and then maternal blood vessels opening and their blood pouring into these lacunae, establishing a primitive placenta. So those are the events we saw that occurred in the second week of intrauterine life. And I decided that before we go to the third week, let us first define what fetal membranes are, because we see them as early as the second week. Of course, they persist up to birth, but we begin seeing them coming into existence as early as the second week. So in principle, you have three cavities: the amniotic cavity, the yolk sac, and the chorionic cavity, which develops within the extraembryonic mesoderm, except at the connecting stalk. The first fetal membrane that we are going to talk about is known as the yolk sac membrane. Yolk sac membrane. Sometimes the word membrane is not added and they just call it yolk sac. So the first fetal membrane we are going to talk about is the yolk sac. And the yolk sac is the membrane which surrounds, the yolk sac membrane is the membrane which surrounds that cavity of the yolk sac. So this is the yolk sac membrane which is surrounding the cavity of the yolk sac. It is the membrane which surrounds the cavity of the yolk sac, and it's known as the yolk sac membrane. This one. And even when you are scanning, you will see that yolk sac membrane, and it will go on decreasing because it will be absorbed within the embryo. The next membrane is the amniotic membrane or the amnion. The amniotic membrane or the amnion. The amniotic membrane is that membrane that surrounds the amniotic cavity. The wall or the boundary of the amniotic cavity is known as the amniotic membrane. So it is the membrane which surrounds the amniotic cavity. And this is the one. This is the amnion or amniotic membrane. So we have looked at the yolk sac or yolk sac membrane surrounding the cavity of the yolk sac, the amnion or the amniotic membrane surrounding the amniotic cavity. The third membrane is the chorion. If this is our chorionic cavity, and here you can see it, this one, because these cavities later coalesce to form one continuous cavity. If this is the amniotic cavity, chorionic cavity, not amniotic, if this is the chorionic cavity, so this is the chorionic cavity. Originally, it is made up of different cavities which coalesce to form one continuous cavity, which is the chorionic cavity, except at the connecting stop. And this is what we refer to, this one. It's the extra-embryonic cavity, or you can call it extra-embryonic serum, or you can call it chorionic cavity. They also call it gestational sac. So this outer membrane which lines it is the chorionic membrane or the chorion. And when you look at it, it is this one. This is the chorionic membrane or the chorion. And you see it's made up of these two layers of trophoblast and this layer of extraembryonic mesoderm. So this is the boundary of the chorionic cavity, and it is the chorionic membrane. So yolk sac membrane, amniotic membrane, chorionic membrane. Yolk sac membrane or yolk sac surrounding the yolk sac cavity. Amniotic membrane or amnion surrounding the amniotic cavity. Chorionic membrane or chorion surrounding the chorionic cavity. Those are three fetal membranes. Let's see them here. This is the yolk sac membrane surrounding the yolk sac cavity. This is the amniotic membrane surrounding the amniotic cavity. The yolk sac membrane surrounding the yolk sac cavity. The amniotic membrane or the amnion surrounding the amniotic cavity. The chorionic membrane surrounding the chorionic cavity, which is also known as the extraembryonic cavity and also known as the gestational sac. Let us first have an illustration to see these membranes before we proceed. So far we have seen three membranes. Chorionic membrane, it is surrounding the chorionic cavity. Yolk sac membrane or yolk sac surrounding the yolk sac cavity. amniotic membrane or amnion surrounding the amniotic cavity. You can see this exactly when you're scanning an embryo in the first trimester. The big cavity is the chorionic cavity. Its boundary is the chorionic membrane. So the big cavity is the chorionic cavity. And its boundary is the chorionic membrane. On the inside, you see a smaller cavity, which is the yolk sac cavity, and surrounded by the yolk sac or yolk sac membrane. On the inside, you have the yolk sac cavity, which is surrounded by the yolk sac or yolk sac membrane. At this stage, the embryo and amniotic cavity are very small, so they are not so much elaborate, but they are in this region, the embryo and the amniotic cavity. But as the fetus grows, you're going to see them also coming out clearly. And the amniotic cavity is also surrounded by the amniotic membrane. Let us see a more mature one and then visualize these membranes again. So as usual, the big cavity is which cavity?
The chorionic cavity.
And its boundary is surrounded by which membrane?
The chorionic membrane.
Chorionic membrane or the chorion. On the inside, we see the yolk sac cavity and is surrounded by the yolk sac membrane. Then we see our embryo surrounded by a cavity known as the amniotic cavity. This is the amniotic cavity, and this is the amnion or amniotic membrane. This is the amniotic cavity, and this is the amniotic membrane. But I say that this yolk sac cavity or yolk sac is going to be absorbed, and with progressing gestation, it's going to become smaller and smaller until it disappears. But at this point in the first trimester, you can see it. So when they talk about the chorionic membrane, yolk sac membrane, and amniotic membrane, do not get confused. Do not get confused. Don't just cram them, but know where they are located. The fourth membrane is the placenta. But before I talk about the placenta, I'm going to talk about the two parts of the chorion. The two parts of the chorion. The chorion is divided into two parts. The chorion is this membrane forming the boundary of the chorionic cavity. This is the chorion. This membrane is made up of two parts. The first part is the chorion leve. Chorion leve. And the second part is the chorion frondulosum. So the two parts of the chorion, we have the chorion leve, and then we have the chorion frondulosum. The chorion frondulosum is this part of the chorion which participates in the formation of the placenta, and it is made up of these folds known as villi. These are villi. So this part of the chorion which participates in the formation of the placenta folds to form what we call villi. So this part of the chorion which folds at the region of the placenta is the one we call the chorion frondulosum. This is known as the chorion frondulosum. It's the folded part of the chorion. These villi here, they are known as primary villi, but they will progress to form secondary villi, and then the secondary villi will form tertiary villi in the third trimester, towards the third trimester. And the tertiary villi have blood vessels. So this part of the chorion at the region of the placenta, which is folded to form this villi, is the chorion frondulosum, and this other part of the chorion which is not folded and is not found in the region of the placenta is the one known as the chorion leve. It also has blood within it, but much blood is in the chorion frondulosum, which is going to participate in the formation of the placenta. Now, the fourth membrane is the placenta. What is the placenta? What is the placenta? The placenta is made up of the chorion and the maternal tissue. I repeat, the placenta is made up of the chorionic membrane, which we have seen, and maternal tissue. By maternal tissue, we mean the maternal blood and endometrium. The maternal blood and endometrium. So the maternal blood and endometrium form the maternal part of the placenta, and the chorion forms the embryonic or fetal part of the placenta. So when we are talking about the placenta, it is equal to chorionic membrane, specifically chorion frondulosum, and then maternal tissue, which is made up of endometrium and maternal blood. That is what we call placenta. The mother contributes blood and endometrium. The embryo or fetus contributes the chorionic membrane. Together, those become the placenta. That is the fourth fetal membrane. Then the fifth fetal membrane is the allantois. The fifth fetal membrane is the allantois. I want you to open your eyes and look carefully. This is the embryo after 4 weeks. But for us, we are still in the second week. But we are going to project and go to the 4th week to look at that membrane known as the allantois properly. So you're going to find that this is our embryo, which developed from the inner cell mass. It is surrounded by the amniotic cavity, which grows with it. It is surrounded by the amniotic cavity, which grows with it. And the amniotic cavity is surrounded by the amniotic membrane. This is our embryo. It is surrounded by the amniotic cavity, which grows with it. And the amniotic cavity is surrounded by the amniotic membrane, which we have seen. External to the amniotic cavity, we have the chorionic cavity or gestational sac or extraembryonic serum, which is surrounded by the chorionic membrane. The yolk sac is also surrounded by the yolk sac membrane, but it becomes absorbed into the embryo. That is why it becomes smaller, because it gets absorbed into the embryo. When it gets absorbed into the embryo, it forms the digestive system of the embryo, as you are seeing. It forms the digestive system of the embryo. And the digestive system of the embryo is known as the gut. So that when I talk about the gut, I talk about the embryonic digestive system. So when the yolk sac is absorbed, it forms the digestive system of the embryo, which is known as the gut. Therefore, the gut comes from the yolk sac, which is absorbed. We have the foregut, which forms the esophagus, stomach, and part of the duodenum. We have the midgut, small intestines, parts of the large intestines, and we have the hind gut. This is the hind gut. Now, I want you to observe very carefully. Observe very carefully. Are you seeing that part of the hindgut is protruding into the connecting stalk? Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that? This part of the hindgut, but don't forget the gut came from the yolk sac. So some texts will tell you that part of the yolk sac. Part of the yolk sac or hindgut protrudes into the connecting stalk. You can also see it here. This is the yolk sac forming the gut, and part of it protrudes into the connecting stalk. So this part of the yolk sac or hindgut, which protrudes into the connecting stalk, is known as the allantois. Is known as the allantois. This is another fetal membrane, part of the yolk sac or embryonic gut, which protrudes into the connecting stalk, is known as the allantois. The function of the allantois, you go and read about it, but it excretes nitrogenous wastes. It excretes nitrogenous wastes. This allantois is another fetal membrane. Its functions during embryonic life is that it excretes nitrogenous wastes from the embryo towards the region of the placenta, so that those wastes are taken out of the embryo. So it's an excretory structure during embryonic life. After birth, it closes. After birth, it closes, and it is known as the urachus. After birth, it closes, and it is known as the urachus. When you open the body of an adult, you're going to see a solid structure connecting the apex of the urinary bladder to the umbilicus. It is a solid structure connecting the apex of the urinary bladder to the umbilicus. That solid structure is known as the urachus, which in embryonic life we call the allantois, and it was excreting nitrogenous wastes. So we have talked about the yolk sac membrane surrounding the yolk sac, the amniotic membrane surrounding the amniotic cavity, the chorionic membrane surrounding the chorionic cavity, the placenta, which is made up of the chorion and the maternal tissue, and then the allantois, which is a protrusion of the yolk sac into the connecting stalk, which excretes nitrogenous wastes from the embryo externally towards the placenta, and they are taken out. The cavities must be remembered very well. I talked about them yesterday, and I'm also going to talk about them today. This is the embryo. This is the yolk sac, which is going to be absorbed. It's going to become smaller. This is the amniotic cavity, which is going to increase in size with the increasing embryo. And this is the chorionic cavity, or the extraembryonic cavity, or the gestational sac. And you see these cavities on ultrasound. Still, here we are seeing the yolk sac or vitelline sac being absorbed, and most of it has formed the digestive system. And this is our embryo, which is now developing, and it came from the inner cell mass. Surrounding it is the chorionic cavity, and external to the chorionic cavity is aligned by the chorionic membrane or the the amniotic, sorry. This is the embryo. Surrounding it is the amniotic cavity, which grows with it. And the amniotic cavity is surrounded by the amniotic membrane or amnion. External to the amniotic membrane is the chorionic cavity or gestational sac. It is surrounded by the chorionic membrane, which is made up of the chorion leve and the chorion frondilosum. Lining the chorionic membrane is the decidua capsularis. This decidua capsularis is continuous with the decidua parietalis. And this decidua is endometrium. And the decidua or endometrium which participates in the formation of the placenta is the decidua besalis. Between the decidua capsularis and the decidua parietalis, we have the uterine cavity. Now, when this embryo increases in size, it increases in size by growing outwardly. It increases in size by growing outwardly. Originally, we have this illustration at an early stage. The embryo, and you see the yolk sac being absorbed. The amniotic cavity, the amniotic membrane, the chorionic cavity or the gestational sac, the chorionic membrane, the decidua capsularis and the decidua parietalis, then the decidua besalis. This embryo increases in size, it grows outwardly. When it grows outwardly, the amniotic membrane fuses with the chorionic membrane, so that the chorionic cavity or gestational sac obliterates. With continuous growth, the chorionic membrane and the decidua capsularis also will fuse with the decidua parietalis at this level, and also the uterine cavity above will also close. And that is what we are seeing here. What we are seeing here is simple. Increased growth of the embryo is going to cause the amniotic membrane to fuse with the chorionic membrane, hence closing or obliterating the chorionic cavity or gestational sac. So it moves out of view. When growth continues, the decidua capsularis at this level where we have the implantation will also fuse with the decidua parietalis, so that you're no longer seeing the chorionic cavity and you're no longer seeing the uterine cavity at this level because of the fusion of all these membranes and obliteration of the cavities between them, such that the only cavity which will remain in view is the amniotic cavity, which will be surrounding the embryo. And this is where all those cavities and membranes fused. And that is what you have here. So it means that late in gestation, when you go to the third trimester, you're going to see the embryo or the fetus. When you go to the third trimester, you're going to see the fetus surrounded by the amniotic cavity. Then you ask yourself, Where is the chorionic cavity, the gestational sac? Where is the uterine cavity? It is because these two, the gestational sac, which is the chorionic cavity, and their membranes and the uterine cavity fused together as a result of increasing size of the embryo. And that is what you're going to see. So in the third trimester, don't ask for the gestational sac, don't ask for the uterine cavity. Just know that they are fused together as a result of the increasing size of the fetus, and what is remaining, you're seeing the amniotic cavity and the fetus. These are the ones you will see in the third trimester. We use the word embryo from week 1 up to week 8. From week 1 up to week 8, the unborn is known as the embryo. And from week 9 up to birth, the unborn is known as a fetus. That is why the period between week 9 up to birth is known as the fetal period. So the word embryo is used up to the 8th week, and from the 8th week, we call the unborn the fetus. So here you can see still the gestational sac, you can see the chorion and its decidua capsularis, you can see the decidua parietalis and the uterine cavity in between them. But all of this will disappear. All of this will disappear with the increasing development of the embryo. All of these ones are going to fuse, and you remain with the embryo being surrounded by the amniotic cavity. So today we have looked at the fetal membranes, the yolk sac membrane, the amniotic membrane, the chorionic membrane, the placenta, and the allantois. I have also told you how during the third trimester, because of increasing size of the embryo, the chorionic cavity or the gestational sac will close, the uterine cavity will close, and what will remain in view is the amniotic cavity surrounding the embryo. We began, at the beginning, we began by doing the menstrual cycle, then we did the first week, then we did the abnormalities of the first week, then we did yesterday the second week, and today we have looked at the fetal membranes. And tomorrow we are going to proceed and we see what happens in the third week of intrauterine life. So is the somatic layer of the extraembryonic mesoderm part of the chorion? Yes. Chorion is made up of the two layers of trophoblast and the somatic layer of the extraembryonic mesoderm. Can the allantois be seen clearly at the end of the second week? No. You're going to see the connecting stalk. You're going to see the connecting stalk. And the connecting stalk is going to convert into the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord contains the umbilical arteries, the umbilical veins, and the allantois. That connecting stalk is going to become the umbilical cord, and the umbilical cord is going to contain the umbilical veins, umbilical arteries, allantois, which entered into it. The umbilical veins are going to come from the cells of the connecting stalk. The chorionic cavity contains fluid, and the uterine cavity, as usual, does not contain fluid. So there is fluid in the chorionic cavity, but afterwards that fluid is absorbed by the chorionic membrane. Afterwards, that fluid is absorbed by the chorionic membrane. So the fluid in the chorionic cavity is afterwards absorbed by the chorionic membrane. And some of it can enter and become part of the amniotic fluid. The uterine cavity is always empty, does not contain fluid. We are going to see that during the third week, the endoderm cells surrounding the yolk sac will be replaced by cells coming in from epiblast. Endoderm cells which are surrounding the yolk sac in the third week, they are going to be replaced by the cells coming in from epiblast. So that is true, but it occurs in the third week, and we are going to see it tomorrow. Some cells of the cells of the connecting stalk, some of them form the umbilical arteries, some of them form the umbilical veins, and the rest can break down and form what you call Wharton's jelly, that gel-like structure within the umbilical cord. Is there a significant effect of the position of implantation on the direction of bulging of the uterus or belly? No. The same effect comes about because it is all a bulge. Maybe the positioning of the placenta is the one which changes. There is no significant difference. Significant means that it can easily be observed. The oogonia and the spermatogonia cells come from. Now we are going to look at the different structures of the body and the parts of the inner cell mass where they develop from. That is going to be, Harbison, that is going to be answered after the third week. The third week, the bilaminar germ disc is going to convert into a trilaminar germ disc, and each of those 3 layers is going to give us cells. However, the yolk sac is the one which gives rise to the oogonia and spermatogonia. So the spermatogonia and oogonia come from the yolk sac and they migrate to the developing gonads. And we shall look at that when looking at that embryology. Oogonia, one of the functions of the yolk sac is to give rise to the gametes, but those gametes have not yet developed. They will go and enter into the developing gonads, and then they begin differentiating.